There are mysteries buried so deep in the sacred text that even the faithful dare not speak them aloud. Secrets that have slumbered in the shadows of Scripture for thousands of years, waiting. What if everything you've been taught about the Great Flood was only half the story? What if the giants, those towering Nephilim who once walked the earth in defiance of heaven itself, never truly perished beneath the waters of judgment? Tonight, we pull back the veil on a truth so profound, so carefully hidden, that 90% of believers have never heard it. Moses, the lawgiver, the man who spoke with God face to face, left us clues. Breadcrumbs of divine revelation scattered through Genesis like stars in a darkened sky. You see, when the waters receded and Noah's family stepped onto dry ground, they believed they were the only survivors. But what if something else survived? Not clinging to the ark's hull, not hiding in its depths, but traveling within the very bloodlines that would repopulate the earth? The sons of Anak, Goliath of Gath, the giants who terrorized Israel centuries after the flood, should have erased them forever. Where did they come from? How did the cursed seed of heaven's rebellion find its way back into our world? The answer lies not in myth or speculation, but in the careful words of Moses himself, in genealogies most skip over, in curses most misunderstand, in a genetic mystery that stretches from the ark to the promised land, and perhaps to your own family tree. This isn't ancient history, beloved. This is a warning, because if the enemy found a way to preserve his corruption once, what makes you think he isn't doing it again? Before we journey together into these sacred mysteries, I want to thank every single one of you who has supported this message through Super Thanks. Your generosity means more than you know. You're not just giving, you're helping spread light to others who feel alone in their calling. Whether you sow seeds or not, I'm deeply grateful for your presence here, your time, your seeking heart. It all matters to the kingdom. So I ask you now, are you ready to discover what Moses buried in plain sight? Are you prepared to learn how the giants truly survived, and why that knowledge might be the key to understanding the spiritual battles raging in your own life today? Because some truths are too dangerous to ignore, and too sacred to keep hidden any longer. Picture this: in the wilderness of Sinai, beneath stars that witnessed creation itself, an aging Moses sits by flickering firelight. His weathered hands grip a reed pen, divine words flowing like honey onto sacred parchment. But this is not mythology he's recording. This is memory. Heaven's memory. The testimony of one who watched it all unfold. And in that holy silence, Moses writes something that would haunt humanity for millennia. The Nephilim were on the earth in those days, and also afterward. Genesis 6-4. 3 words that shatter everything we thought we knew about the flood. And also afterward. Feel the weight of those words. Let them settle into your spirit like stones into deep water. Moses wasn't just a historian. He was a prophet who spoke with God face to face, who climbed mountains wrapped in divine fire, who saw the glory of the Almighty and lived to tell about it. When Moses wrote "and also afterward," he wasn't speculating. He was remembering. God's memory. Heaven's record. The truth that would be buried beneath centuries of comfortable theology. But what did Moses know that we forgot? You see, for generations, we've been told a simple story. The flood came, the giants died, Noah's family repopulated the earth. The end. Clean, neat, comfortable. But Moses left us breadcrumbs, sacred clues scattered through the genealogies like ancient treasure maps, waiting for those brave enough to follow them into the darkness. Because here's what keeps haunting the text. If God's judgment was total, if every breathing thing outside that wooden sanctuary perished beneath the waters, then how do we explain what happened next? Fast forward 4 centuries after the floodwaters receded. The sons of Israel stand trembling on the edge of the promised land, and their spies return with a report that chills the blood. We saw the Nephilim there. The descendants of Anak come from the Nephilim. We seemed like grasshoppers in our own eyes, and we looked the same to them. Numbers 13:33. The same word. Nephilim. Not giants. Not tall men. Nephilim. The fallen ones. The very beings whose corruption had once provoked heaven's wrath and drowned the world. Do you feel it? That tremor in your spirit? That whisper asking, how? The traditional explanations begin to crumble under scrutiny. Some say fallen angels sinned again after the flood, creating a second generation of Nephilim. But the Book of Enoch, revered by ancient Jews and quoted by Jude himself, paints a different picture. It tells of the Watcher's judgment being so severe, so eternal, that even Michael the archangel trembled at its magnitude. Would any angel dare repeat such rebellion after witnessing their brethren bound in everlasting chains? Others suggest a Nephilim somehow clung to the ark's hull, riding out the storm like some ancient stowaway. But Genesis speaks with surgical precision. Of them was the whole earth overspread, Noah's 3 sons, no stowaways, no exceptions, no room for secret passengers in God's arithmetic of survival. Yet the giants returned, not metaphorically, not symbolically, literally, 9 feet tall, 6 fingers on each hand, terrorizing God's people with the same otherworldly strength that had once filled the earth with violence. So we're left with a mystery that cuts to the heart of everything. If all flesh perished outside the ark, who let them back in? The answer lies hidden in plain sight, woven through the genealogies most Christians skip over, buried in curses most believers misunderstand. Moses knew. The ancient rabbis whispered about it in hushed tones. Early church fathers wrestled with its implications. But somewhere along the way, we stopped asking the hard questions. We chose comfort over truth. The Bible says they died beneath the flood. Yet Numbers declares they lived to fight another day. One of these truths is not what it seems. One carries a secret that could reshape everything you thought you knew about bloodlines, curses, and the patient persistence of ancient evil. What if the corruption didn't travel on the outside of the ark, but on the inside? What if it didn't cling to ropes and timber, but to DNA itself? What if the seed of the Nephilim found a way to survive not as monsters in the water, but as whispers in the blood? Moses left us the clues, scattered through Genesis like stars in a dark sky, hidden in the curse of Canaan, embedded in the lineage of Ham, traced through the bloodlines that would produce the very giants Israel would face in the Promised Land. But seeing these clues requires something most believers fear: the willingness to ask uncomfortable questions about comfortable doctrines, the courage to follow Moses into the wilderness of forbidden knowledge, the faith to believe that God's word contains mysteries deeper than our Sunday school flannel boards ever dared suggest. This isn't about conspiracy theories or sensational speculation. This is about the sacred text itself, about hidden truths that have been staring us in the face for thousands of years, waiting for a generation brave enough to pull back the veil. The flood was never just about water. It was about corruption, about preserving the pure line through which salvation would come, about protecting the promise of a coming Messiah from genetic contamination that reached back to the fallen angels themselves. And if that corruption found a way to survive, if it learned to hide in recessive genes and dormant bloodlines, if it discovered how to pass through the very vessel of salvation while remaining undetected, then perhaps the flood wasn't the end of the Nephilim story. Perhaps it was just the beginning of a cover-up that would span millennia. Comment 777 if you've ever felt that the flood wasn't the end but the beginning of something far more complex and mysterious than we've been taught. Because what Moses reveals next will shake the foundations of everything you thought you knew about the giants, the flood, and the bloodlines that still walk among us today. The scroll is just beginning to unroll, and the secrets it contains, they're not finished with us yet. In the beginning, before the floodwaters rose to judge the earth, there walked beings among us who should never have existed, creatures born not of God's design, but of heaven's rebellion. Their footprints shook the ground, their shadows darkened the sky, and their very breath carried the stench of corruption that would nearly destroy everything the Almighty had called good. Tonight, we step into the forbidden pages of Genesis 6, where Moses recorded words so disturbing, so spiritually dangerous, that many pastors avoid them altogether. Because what happened in those days before the flood wasn't just ancient history, it was a warning, a prophecy, a glimpse into the kind of evil that makes the Creator himself weep. The Watchers, heaven's first rebellion. Long before Noah ever heard God's voice calling him to build an ark, before the first raindrop fell from heaven's judgment, there were beings called the Watchers, angels assigned to observe humanity, to guard the boundary between the divine and the mortal. But observation turned to obsession, and obsession turned to sin. The Book of Enoch, revered by ancient Jews and quoted in the New Testament by Jude himself, pulls back the veil on what really happened. These weren't random fallen angels acting alone. They were a conspiracy. 200 of heaven's watchers, led by one called Semjaza, who looked down from their holy dwelling and saw something that stirred desires they were never meant to feel. Genesis 6:2 whispers the terrible truth. The sons of God saw that the daughters of men were beautiful, and they married any of them they chose. But this wasn't marriage as God intended. This was cosmic treason, angels abandoning their first estate, stepping out of eternity and into flesh, driven by lusts that would curse every generation that followed. Can you imagine the moment? The very beings who once stood in the presence of the Most High, who sang holy, holy, holy before his throne, now descending like falling stars to corrupt the daughters of Adam. The boundary between heaven and earth didn't just blur, it shattered. The forbidden union. What followed wasn't romance, it was contamination. When divine beings, creatures of spirit and fire, mingled their essence with human flesh, the result was abomination. Genesis 6:4 records it with haunting simplicity. The Nephilim were on the earth in those days and also afterward, when the sons of God went to the daughters of humans and had children by them. Those children weren't just unusually tall, they were hybrids, part human, part something else entirely. The Hebrew word Nephilim means fallen ones, but it carries depths of meaning that translation cannot capture. These were beings who had fallen not just in stature, but in spiritual reality. They were living violations of the order God had established. The Book of Enoch describes them in chilling detail. Giants who consumed everything in their path, who turned to cannibalism when the earth could no longer sustain their appetites, who taught humanity the arts of war, sorcery, and seduction. They weren't just physically monstrous, they were spiritually parasitic, feeding off the corruption they spread like a cancer through the bloodlines of men. But here's what haunts the pages of Scripture even more. These watchers didn't just create monsters. They taught forbidden knowledge. Azazel taught men to make weapons of war and taught women the art of cosmetics and seduction. Semjaza revealed the secrets of enchantments. Others unveiled the mysteries of astrology, divination, and the cutting of roots, knowledge that was meant to remain hidden until the proper time. The earth cried out. What began as desire became a plague. Violence didn't just increase, it became the very heartbeat of civilization. Genesis 6:5 captures the horror. The Lord saw how great the wickedness of the human race had become on the earth, and that every inclination of the thoughts of the human heart was only evil all the time. Picture it, a world where giants ruled through terror, where fallen angels walked among men teaching them to corrupt everything sacred, where human women bore children who would grow to devour their own neighbors. The earth itself groaned under the weight of such violation. The very ground cried out for justice. And in the middle of this cosmic nightmare, the Bible records something that should make every believer tremble. The Lord regretted that he had made human beings on the earth, and his heart was deeply troubled. The Creator himself, the one who spoke galaxies into existence, was grieved to his very core. This wasn't divine anger. This was divine heartbreak. The God who had walked with Adam in the cool of the day, who had breathed life into human nostrils, who had called his creation very good, that same God now looked upon the earth and saw nothing but corruption spreading like wildfire through the bloodlines he had blessed. The spiritual parasites. But here's the truth most dare not speak. The Nephilim weren't just giants. They were spiritual parasites of heaven's rebellion. Every breath they took was a mockery of God's design. Every step they walked defiled the ground beneath their feet. They were living proof that when the supernatural mingles with the natural outside of God's will, the result isn't evolution, it's devolution. Not progression, but corruption. These beings carried within their very DNA the memory of heaven's glory twisted into hell's rebellion. They were stronger than any human, taller than any man, more cunning than any creature. But they were also empty, hollow vessels, carrying the echo of a song they could never sing again, the memory of a light they could never return to. And here's what should make your blood run cold. They weren't content to exist. They were driven to corrupt, to spread their contamination, to pull every pure thing down into the mire of their own spiritual death. They weren't just the product of fallen angel sin, they were the instruments of its continuation. The divine grief. In all of Scripture, perhaps no verse carries more weight than Genesis 6:6. The Lord regretted that he had made human beings on the earth, and his heart was deeply troubled. The Hebrew word for regretted is nachamit, means to sigh, to breathe heavily, to feel such deep sorrow that it changes your very breath. God didn't regret because he made a mistake. The Almighty doesn't make mistakes. He regretted because love always grieves when what it loves chooses destruction. A father doesn't regret having a son who becomes a murderer because the Son was destined to kill, and regrets it because love wanted something better. The Creator looked upon his creation and saw that the image of God in humanity had been so twisted, so corrupted by the Nephilim's influence, that something drastic had to be done, not in anger, but in mercy. Because sometimes love expresses itself through judgment. Sometimes the surgeon's knife is the kindest cut. But God wiped them out, right? And so the decision was made. The floodwaters would come. Every living thing that breathed air would perish. The earth would be washed clean, baptized in judgment, given a fresh start through the family of one righteous man, Noah. The waters rose. The Nephilim drowned. The watchers were bound in chains of darkness. The contamination was cleansed. Or was it? Because here's the question that has haunted biblical scholars for millennia. If the flood destroyed all the Nephilim, all the giants, all the corrupted bloodlines, then how do we explain what happened next? How do we account for the giants that terrorized Israel centuries later? The sons of Anak, who made grown warriors feel like grasshoppers. Goliath of Gath, whose very presence struck fear into the hearts of God's chosen people. Moses himself hints at the answer when he writes in Genesis 6-4, "The Nephilim were on the earth in those days and also afterward." That word afterward hangs in the air like a storm cloud. It suggests continuation, survival, return. But how? How did the seed of heaven's rebellion survive the very judgment meant to erase it? How did the giants find their way back into a world that God had cleansed with floodwaters? The answer lies not in what climbed aboard the ark from the outside, but in what may have traveled within it. Hidden, silent, waiting, carried in the very bloodlines that were meant to repopulate the earth. And if that's true, if the contamination found a way to survive God's judgment once, then what does that mean for us today? What giants are we facing that we thought were dead and buried? What corruptions are we tolerating that we believed were washed away long ago? Because the story of the Nephilim isn't just ancient history. It's a warning, a revelation, a mirror held up to our own generation, asking us to consider: what forbidden unions are we allowing? What boundaries are we crossing? What giants are we creating? Or allowing to return? The waters have receded, the dove has returned with her olive branch, and Noah stands upon Mount Ararat, breathing the first clean air of a world washed by divine judgment. Every living creature outside that vessel of obedience has perished. The Nephilim, those towering abominations born of fallen angels and human women, have been erased from the face of the earth. Or so it seemed. But here lies the mystery that has haunted theologians for millennia. If God's flood was complete, if every breath of corrupted life was extinguished beneath those waters of wrath, then how do we explain what the spies of Israel would later witness in the Promised Land? How do we reconcile the divine promise of total cleansing with the terrifying reality that giants would walk the earth again? Listen to their trembling words in Numbers 13:33. "There we saw the giants, the descendants of Anak, who come from the giants, and we were like grasshoppers in our own sight, and so we were in their sight." Grasshoppers, grown men, warriors of Israel, reduced to insects in the shadow of beings who should not have existed. These were not metaphors. These were not exaggerations born of fear. These were the sons of Anak, literal giants whose very presence mocked the completeness of God's judgment. So we must ask the uncomfortable question that echoes through the corridors of sacred history: where did they come from? For centuries, desperate theories have emerged from the shadows of biblical scholarship. Some whispered that perhaps a Nephilim had somehow clung to the ark's hull, riding the waves of destruction like a parasite on salvation's vessel. Others suggested that the fallen angels, those watchers who had corrupted the antediluvian world, had sinned again after the flood, taking human wives and birthing a new generation of giants. But both theories crumble under the weight of Scripture itself. Genesis 9:18-19 declares with divine authority, "Now the sons of Noah, who went out of the ark, were Shem, Ham, and Japheth, and from these the whole earth was populated." Read those words again, slowly. From the sea, not from hidden stowaways, not from secret survivors, the whole earth was populated. The text leaves no room for mystery passengers. Every human being who drew breath after the flood descended from these three men and their wives. And as for the fallen angels repeating their primordial sin, the Book of Enoch, that ancient text quoted by Jude himself, paints a picture of divine judgment so severe that even the archangel Michael trembled. The watchers who had corrupted the first world were bound in chains of darkness, imprisoned until the day of final judgment. Their punishment was so fearsome that no angel would dare repeat their transgression. No, the answer to our mystery lies not in external invasion, but in internal inheritance, not in what climbed aboard the ark, but in what was already dwelling within its sacred walls. Consider this truth that makes the blood run cold. The giants didn't need to survive the flood. They only needed their seed to survive. And that seed, microscopic, invisible, dormant, may have been carried within the very bloodlines that God himself had chosen to preserve. Think about genetics as we understand them today. A recessive trait can hide for generations, lurking in the shadows of DNA, waiting for the perfect combination to bring it forth. Blue eyes can skip 3 generations before appearing in a child whose brown-eyed parents never suspected what lay dormant in their genes. What if the Nephilim trait functioned the same way? What if gigantism, that mark of angelic corruption, had become woven into certain human bloodlines like a curse written in genetic code? What if one of the wives who entered that ark, righteous in heart, pure in spirit, faithful to God, unknowingly carried within her womb the recessive echo of heaven's ancient rebellion? The Bible doesn't name Noah's daughters-in-law. It doesn't trace their genealogies or examine their bloodlines. But in that sacred silence, a terrible possibility emerges. Could one of them have been descended from the unions between the sons of God and the daughters of men? Could she have carried, hidden in her very cells, the dormant potential for giants to rise again? Scripture hints at this possibility in ways most readers never notice. When Moses writes about Ham throughout Genesis, he doesn't simply call him Ham. Again and again, he refers to him as Ham, the father of Canaan. The repetition is deliberate, almost obsessive. Why does the inspired author feel compelled to remind us, over and over, of this particular lineage? Because from Canaan would come the very giants that Israel would face. The sons of Anak, the Philistines, Goliath himself all trace their ancestry back to Ham's cursed line. Not cursed because of skin color, as some have blasphemously taught, but cursed because of spiritual corruption that may have reached deeper than anyone imagined. Consider the disturbing incident recorded in Genesis 9, when Noah lay drunk and naked in his tent. Ham saw the nakedness of his father and told his brothers. While we'll explore the full implications of this event in another study, the consequence was immediate and prophetic. Noah cursed not Ham himself, but Canaan, Ham's son. Cursed be Canaan, a servant of servants he shall be to his brethren. Why curse the son for the father's sin, unless something about that lineage carried a contamination that would manifest in future generations? Unless Noah, in his prophetic wisdom, could see what was coming through that bloodline, the resurgence of the very corruption the flood was meant to destroy. And where did Canaan's descendants settle? In a land that would become infamous for its giants. The Anakim, the Rephaim, the sons of Anak, who would terrorize the spies of Israel, all dwelt in the regions that bore Canaan's name. The puzzle pieces begin to form a picture too terrible and too perfect to ignore. The giants didn't climb aboard the ark. They were born from a hidden seed already riding within, dormant in the bloodstream of the very family God had chosen to preserve. In ancient times, before the law was given, intermarriage within families was not only common but necessary for humanity's survival. When Canaan's descendants married within their own tribes, any recessive Nephilim traits would have had a far greater chance of manifesting. The results were exactly what we see in Scripture. Giants in Gath, warriors with 6 fingers and 6 toes, beings of such stature that grown men felt like insects in their presence. This is why God's later commands to Israel seem so harsh to modern ears. When he ordered the complete destruction of the Canaanite nations, it wasn't genocide, it was surgery. He was cutting out a spiritual cancer before it could spread, removing from the earth a contamination that had already nearly destroyed it once before. The giants didn't survive the flood by clinging to wood and rope. They survived by hiding in the most unexpected place of all within the chosen vessels of salvation themselves, sleeping in genetic silence until the perfect moment to rise again. Could you have seen it coming? If you had stood beside Noah as his family emerged from the ark, would you have been able to tell which bloodline carried the curse? Would you have recognized the seed of giants gestating in the womb of future generations? The most terrifying corruptions are often the ones we never see coming. They don't announce themselves with fanfare. They don't carry signs or wear identifying marks. They travel in silence, in genetics, in the spaces between what we know and what we assume. And if the enemy found a way to preserve his corruption once through the very bloodlines God chose to save, what makes you think he isn't doing it again? Tag someone who needs to hear this truth, because spiritual DNA still matters today. The giants you're facing in your own life might not carry swords, but they carry the same ancient rebellion. And like David facing Goliath, you need to know where your enemy really came from before you can know how to bring him down. The floodwaters had long since receded. The earth breathed again beneath cloudless skies. Noah, the righteous remnant, had led his family into a new world, cleansed, sanctified, washed free from the corruption that once poisoned every living thing. But even in paradise regained, the human heart remains. The human. Picture this sacred moment, if you will. Noah, the man who walked with God through the darkest hour in human history, plants a vineyard. Perhaps it was celebration. Perhaps it was relief. Perhaps it was simply the deep exhale of a soul that had carried the weight of an entire species on his shoulders. He drinks of the wine, and in his tent, in his vulnerability, something happens that will echo through every generation that follows. Genesis 9:22 records it with brutal simplicity. And Ham, the father of Canaan, saw the nakedness of his father and told his two brethren without. But pause here. Linger in the sacred silence between these words. What exactly did Ham see? What exactly did he do? The Hebrew text whispers of something deeper, something more violating than a mere glance. Some ancient rabbinical sources suggest Ham didn't just see dishonored, he violated. He committed an act so shameful that when Noah awoke, he knew immediately what had transpired. And Noah's response? Not the gentle correction of a father to a wayward son, not a private rebuke behind closed doors. This was a prophetic pronouncement that would shape the spiritual geography of the earth for millennia to come. Cursed be Canaan, Noah declared. A servant of servants shall he be unto his brethren. Notice what Noah didn't say. He didn't curse Ham directly. He cursed Ham's son Canaan, as if the corruption Ham had introduced would not fully manifest in him, but would find its fullest expression in his offspring, as if something dark and ancient had been awakened, and it would travel down through bloodlines like a spiritual infection waiting for the right moment to emerge. This wasn't about skin color, beloved. This wasn't about race or ethnicity. For too long, wicked men have twisted Noah's words to justify their own prejudices, claiming falsely that all of Ham's descendants were cursed. That lie has caused immeasurable pain and has no foundation in Scripture. The curse fell specifically on Canaan's son among four. The others, Cush, Mizraim, and Put, received no such judgment. But Canaan, Canaan, his name would become synonymous with spiritual contamination. His descendants would settle in the very land God had promised to Abraham, and in that land, something would begin to grow, something that should have drowned beneath the flood. Genesis 10 unfolds like a genealogical map of destiny. From Canaan came the Jebusites, the Amorites, the Hivites, the Perizzites. These weren't just tribal names on an ancient census. These were bloodlines that would carry forward something the flood was meant to destroy. Cities would rise from Canaan's seed: Sodom, Gomorrah, Sidon, places where the knowledge of God would be exchanged for the worship of demons, where child sacrifice would stain altars, where the boundaries between heaven and earth would be violated once again. But here's where the mystery deepens, where the hidden truth begins to surface like bones rising from an ancient grave, because it wasn't just rebellion that would mark Canaan's legacy. It was the return of the giants. Numbers 13:33 pierces through time like a sword. There we saw the giants, the sons of Anak, which come of the giants. And we were in our own sight as grasshoppers. And so we were in their sight. The Hebrew word used here is Nephilim, the same word used in Genesis 6 to describe the offspring of fallen angels and human women. The same monstrous hybrid beings that had corrupted the earth before the flood. But how? How could they have returned when every living thing outside the ark had perished? The answer lies in understanding what a curse truly is, not merely harsh words spoken in anger, but a spiritual reality that travels through generations. When Noah cursed Canaan, he wasn't just predicting his future, he was discerning something that was already there. Something hidden. Something that had survived the flood, not as a physical being, but as a genetic whisper, a recessive trait, waiting in the shadows of DNA. Consider this. If one of the wives who entered that ark carried within her the dormant seed of the Nephilim, perhaps she was a distant descendant of those unholy unions. That trait could lie hidden for generations, invisible, undetectable, until the right combination, the right bloodline, the right moment of divine judgment awakened it. And where did this awakening occur? In the land of Canaan, among the cursed line. The Anakim, the Rephaim, the sons of Anak, all of them, dwelling in the very territory that would become Israel's inheritance. This wasn't coincidence. This was spiritual warfare playing out across generations. Deuteronomy 2:10-11 records the terrifying memory. The Emims dwelt therein in times past, a people great, and many, and tall, as the Anakims, which also were accounted giants as the Anakims. These were the nightmares that haunted the ancient world. When the Israelite spies returned from Canaan, they didn't speak of armies or fortified cities. They spoke of giants. Men so tall, so imposing, that grown warriors felt like grasshoppers in their presence. The curse wasn't skin deep, it was bloodline deep, and Canaan's line would become Israel's fiercest foe. But here's what shakes me to the very core of my understanding. What if generational curses aren't always visible? What if the greatest spiritual battles of our time aren't fought against what we can see, but against what travels silently through family lines? What if the giants we face today don't carry swords, but carry DNA? Not weapons, but generational patterns that corrupt from within? Because if the enemy found a way to preserve his corruption through the greatest judgment in human history, if he discovered that bloodlines could carry what floodwaters couldn't wash away, then what makes us think he isn't using the same strategy today? The land of Canaan became a laboratory of spiritual contamination, a place where the ancient rebellion found new expression in towering forms that defied heaven. And God's response? Not negotiation, not tolerance, complete destruction. But before we explore why God commanded what many called genocide, we must first understand what was really at stake. Because sometimes mercy looks like surgery, sometimes love requires a sword, and sometimes the only way to save the future is to cut away the infected past. The silence that followed was deafening. 12 men warriors, scouts, the bravest Israel could offer stood trembling before Moses like children who had glimpsed something from the realm of nightmares. They had crossed into the promised land expecting milk and honey. Instead, they had walked into the shadow of titans. "We went into the land to which you sent us," they began, their voices hollow with terror. And it does flow with milk and honey. But the people who live there are powerful, and the cities are fortified and very large. But then came the words that would haunt Israel for a generation. "We saw the descendants of Anak there. We seemed like grasshoppers in our own eyes, and we looked the same to them." Grasshoppers. Think about that word for a moment. These were not ordinary men speaking. These were seasoned warriors who had witnessed the plagues of Egypt, who had walked through the Red Sea on dry ground, who had seen manna fall from heaven. Yet before the sons of Anak, they felt like insects, fragile, insignificant, utterly powerless. The Hebrew word used here is chagavno, just small, but something that could be crushed without thought, swept away without effort. In the presence of these giants, grown men felt their humanity diminished to nothing more than a whisper in the wind. But here's what chills the soul. Their fear wasn't irrational. It was ancestral. Something deep in their genetic memory recognized these beings. The same spiritual alarm that had once screamed warnings in the days before the flood was now ringing again in the promised land. The corruption that should have drowned was walking among them, ruling from fortified cities, governing territories with the authority of warlords. These weren't just tall men, the Anakim children of Anakware, the living proof that the Nephilim bloodline had survived. They built cities that scraped the sky. They forged weapons that no ordinary warrior could lift. They ruled with a mixture of intelligence, brutality, and supernatural strength that made other nations bow in terror. Hebron, one of the most ancient cities on earth, was their stronghold. Imagine walking through those gates, knowing that every stone was laid by hands that carried the genetic memory of rebellion against heaven itself. The very architecture whispered of defiance towers built not just for defense, but as monuments to the audacity of those who believed they could challenge the Most High. The spy's report continues, with a geological survey of terror. All the people we saw there are of great size. The land devours those living in it. The Hebrew phrase translated as devours is akaleth, it consumes, it swallows, it digests. This wasn't just a dangerous place. It was a realm where the normal order of creation had been violated so thoroughly that the very land itself had become hostile to human life. And then the report turns cosmic. "We saw the Nephilim. They're the descendants of Anak. Come from the Nephilim." That single sentence, shatters every comfortable theology about the flood's completeness. Moses, writing under divine inspiration, doesn't soften the blow. He doesn't offer explanations or apologetics. He simply states the impossible truth: the fallen ones had returned. But notice something profound in God's response. When Israel trembled before these giants, when they declared the conquest impossible, the Almighty didn't comfort them with reassurances about strategy or military tactics. Instead, He issued commands that sound almost surgical in their precision. When the Lord your God brings you into the land you are entering to possess and drives out before you many nations, the Hittites, Girgashites, Amorites, Canaanites, Perizzites, Hivites, and Jebusites, 7 nations larger and stronger than you, and when the Lord your God has delivered them over to you, and you have defeated them, then you must destroy them totally. Make no treaty with them, and show them no mercy. The Hebrew word for destroy totally is karima, term that means complete consecration to destruction, like offering something entirely to fire. This wasn't conquest, it was purification. This wasn't war, it was divine surgery. God didn't tell them to fight men. He told them to destroy contamination. Every instruction that follows carries the weight of cosmic necessity. Do not intermarry with them. Do not give your daughters to their sons, or take their daughters for your sons. Why such absolute separation? Because what lived in those bloodlines wasn't just geneticide, was spiritual poison that could corrupt entire generations. The cities of the Anakim weren't just military targets. They were infection sites where heaven's rebellion had taken root in human flesh. Hebron, where Abraham once walked with God, had become a fortress of the fallen. The very ground that had once hosted divine visitation was now the throne room of hybrid kings who ruled through strength borrowed from hell itself. This is why the conquest of Canaan reads less like military history and more like spiritual chemotherapy. God wasn't commanding genocide. He was ordering the removal of a cancer that threatened to metastasize throughout all of creation. The same corruption that had once moved him to flood the earth was concentrated now in specific bloodlines, specific cities, specific territories that had to be cauterized before they could spread. But here's the question that haunts every honest heart. When the Israelites looked up at those towering figures, when they felt their courage drain away like water, were they seeing their enemies or their future? Because contamination, once introduced, never stays contained. It spreads through compromise, through tolerance, through the deadly assumption that what was once forbidden might now be manageable. The giants of Canaan weren't just occupying territory, they were occupying the space between God's command and Israel's obedience. In that space, that hesitation, that fear, that rationalization, corruption always finds its foothold. So when God told them to show no mercy, to make no treaties, to offer no compromise, He wasn't being cruel. He was being a surgeon, identifying precisely where the blade must cut to save the patient. But why total destruction? Was it genocide or divine surgery? The answer lies not in our comfort with God's methods, but in our understanding of what happens when heaven's rebellion takes root in human flesh. Sometimes mercy looks like firmness. Sometimes love requires the sword. If God told you to cut ties with something that seemed normal, something that others might consider harmless, would you obey or would you rationalize? Because the giants are walking again. And this time, they don't always look like monsters. Transition flowing into part 6. But there's something even more chilling about this ancient contamination. It didn't just threaten Israel's conquest, it threatened the very bloodline through which redemption would come. And as we're about to discover, the enemy's strategy wasn't just about territory. Part 5. When giants walked the promised land, 400 years had passed since the waters receded. 4 centuries of silence, of nations rising, of bloodlines spreading across the earth like rivers branching from a single source. The world had forgotten the giants. The world had moved on. But the earth remembers everything. When Moses sent 12 spies into the land of Canaan, they carried with them the promises of God, the hope of generations, and the weight of divine covenant. They expected to find milk and honey. They expected to find a land flowing with abundance. They did not expect to find their worst nightmares walking upright in broad daylight. Numbers chapter 13 preserves their testimony like a scream trapped in amber. There we saw the giants, the descendants of Anak, who come from the giants, and we were like grasshoppers in our own sight. And so we were in their sight. Grasshoppers. Grown men. warriors of Israel, reduced to insects in the shadow of beings that should not have existed. But there they were breathing, towering, terrifying. The Nephilim had returned. But how? The question that haunted Moses, that haunts us still, carved itself deeper into sacred mystery. If the flood had wiped the slate clean, if Noah's family alone had survived, then where did these giants come from? What door had been left unlocked? What seed had found a way to survive the waters of judgment? The spies brought back more than fear, they brought back names. The sons of Anak, the Rephaim, the Emim. These weren't random anomalies scattered across distant lands. They were tribes, nations, bloodlines that had taken root in the very heart of the Promised Land. And then the pieces of the puzzle began to fall into place. Genesis chapter 10. Table of Nations reads like a genealogical roadmap to this ancient horror. Ham, the son of Noah, had 4 sons: Cush, Mizraim, Put, and Canaan. From Mizraim came the Philistines. From Canaan came the very tribes that would later produce giants. The cursed line of Noah's own flesh had become the breeding ground for the return of the fallen. It wasn't magic. It wasn't mysticism. It was genetics, the patient, relentless memory, embedded in blood and bone, waiting for the right combination to awaken what should have stayed buried. The land of Canaan wasn't just geographically significant, it had become spiritually contaminated. Every valley, every hill, every city had been claimed by descendants of the cursed line. And somewhere in their DNA, dormant but undefeated, the ancient corruption stirred. Moses understood what many still refused to see. This wasn't just about conquering territory. This was about preventing a second fall, about stopping the return of an abomination that had once moved God himself to wipe the earth clean. The Anakim weren't just tall. They were the reactivation of something ancient, something that carried the memory of rebellion in their very cells. When the Israelites saw them, they weren't just seeing enemies, they were seeing the return of the reason for the flood. Centuries later, in the valley of Elah, the sound of a giant's voice would shake the mountains. But Goliath of Gath was not the beginning of the story. He was the crescendo of a song that had been playing in the shadows for generations. 9 feet, 9 inches of corrupted flesh stood between Israel and victory. But what the shepherd boy David faced that day wasn't just a warrior. It was the living embodiment of an ancient curse, the manifestation of a bloodline that traced its roots back through the mists of time to the very reason God once drowned the world. Scripture pulls back the veil with surgical precision. 2 Samuel chapter 21 records that Goliath had brothers, other giants from Gath, who bore the unmistakable marks of genetic anomaly. 6 fingers on each hand, 6 toes on each foot, 24 digits total, as if their very bodies were screaming the truth of their unnatural origin. These weren't birth defects, they were signatures, genetic calling cards left by an ancient violation of the natural order. The extra digits weren't random, they were evidence, written in flesh and bone, of a bloodline that had never been fully human. The Philistines themselves were descendants of Mizraim, Ham's son, carriers of the curse that Noah had pronounced over Canaan. But more than that, they were the genetic repository of something that should have been extinct. The very existence of these giants was proof that the enemy had found a way to preserve his most devastating weapon, the corruption of human DNA itself. Goliath's hometown of Gath wasn't just a city, it was a stronghold of the cursed bloodline, a place where the ancient contamination had been carefully preserved and cultivated. Generation after generation, the recessive traits had been passed down, waiting for the right moment, the right combination, to produce another giant. When David stepped into that valley, he wasn't just facing a man, he was facing the concentrated evil of centuries. The genetic echo of the fallen angel's rebellion. The living proof that some battles are bigger than they appear. But here's what shakes me to the core. Goliath was not alone. He was the tip of a cursed root, buried deep and awakened. The giant that Israel saw was just the visible fruit of an invisible tree that had been growing in the darkness for generations. And that raises a question that should terrify us. How many giants do we face today that we think are just tall problems? How many overwhelming obstacles in our lives are actually the reactivation of ancient curses? Spiritual DNA passed down through generations of compromise, rebellion, and agreement with darkness. The giants didn't die in the flood. They adapted. They evolved. They learned to hide in plain sight, to masquerade as normal problems, normal struggles, normal failures. But giants are never normal. Giants are always the result of something unnatural taking root in what should have been holy ground. David knew something that day that we've forgotten. When you're facing a giant, you're not just fighting flesh and blood. You're fighting principalities, powers, spiritual forces of wickedness in high places. You're fighting the genetic memory of rebellion itself. The stone that flew from David's sling didn't just kill a man, it severed a bloodline, broke a curse, and declared to every hidden giant that the God of Israel still reigns supreme over every corrupted seed that dares to lift its head against heaven. But the story doesn't end there, because if giants survived the flood once, if they found a way to preserve their corruption in the genetic code of Noah's own family, what makes us think they're not doing it again? Right, I refuse to bow. If you're facing giants, no one else sees giants that wear the mask of depression, addiction, generational poverty, family curses, or spiritual oppression. Because the same God who gave David victory is calling you to pick up your stone and declare that the giant stops here, the curse ends with you, and the bloodline of blessing begins today. But here lies a mystery that pierces deeper than ancient genealogies or forgotten bloodlines. A mystery that bridges the gap between the sacred and the scientific, between heaven's judgment and earth's hidden laws. What if the very fabric of creation itself held secrets that Moses understood? Secrets we're only now beginning to glimpse through the lens of modern science? Picture this. A young woman with deep brown eyes gives birth to a child with piercing blue. The father's eyes are brown as well. Yet there, staring back from the cradle, are eyes like Sapphirisa trait that seem to come from nowhere. But it didn't come from nowhere, did it? It was always there, sleeping in the blood, waiting for the perfect moment to awaken. This is the mystery of what we now call recessive genes, traits that can hide for generations, invisible to the naked eye, carried silently through bloodlines until two carriers unite, and suddenly, the hidden becomes manifest. What was dormant springs to life. What was forgotten remembers itself. Now imagine and lean in close to this thought. What if gigantism worked the same way? What if the corrupted seed of the Nephilim, that unholy union between fallen angels and human women, didn't die in the flood, but simply went underground? What if it became recessive, hiding in the very DNA of those who survived on the ark? The implications are staggering. Noah's family, righteous though they were, may have carried within their very cells the sleeping echo of humanity's greatest rebellion. Not because they were evil, but because the contamination had already woven itself so deeply into the human genome that it became invisible, undetectable, until the right combinations unlocked it once again. Consider Ham's line, particularly Canaan, the cursed one. Genesis tells us that from Canaan came the very nations that would later be filled with giants, the Hittites, the Jebusites, the Amorites, and most chilling of all, from Ham's son Mizraim came the Philistines, Goliath's people. But here's where ancient practice meets genetic reality in a way that should make every believer pause and wonder. In those early days after the flood, when the earth was being repopulated, intermarriage within families wasn't just common, it was necessary. Abraham married his half-sister Sarah. Isaac married his cousin Rebekah. Jacob wed two sisters who were also his cousins. The Bible doesn't hide this. It records it matter-of-factly, without shame or condemnation, because in those days, survival demanded such unions. But genetically, spiritually, these close blood marriages created the perfect conditions for recessive traits to surface. When two carriers of the same hidden gene came together, what had been dormant suddenly became dominant. Now imagine this happening within Canaan's tribal line, already marked by divine curse, possibly already carrying the sleeping giant gene. Generation after generation of intermarriage, the recessive trait growing stronger, more likely to manifest, until suddenly, children are born who tower over their parents. Until men emerge who require armor that weighs 125 pounds and carry spears like tree trunks. The ancient Jewish texts speak of this with an understanding that pierces the veil between spiritual and physical reality. The Book of Jubilees describes how the corruption of the Watchers didn't just disappear, it transformed, adapted, found new ways to express itself, not through direct angelic intervention anymore, but through the patient, generational working of corrupted seed. This is why God's command to utterly destroy the Canaanite nations wasn't cruelty, it was surgery, divine surgery on a genetic and spiritual cancer that threatened to metastasize once again. When the Israelites hesitated, when they showed mercy to those marked for destruction, they weren't being compassionate. They were being naive about the true nature of what they faced. But here's where this ancient mystery becomes personal, where it reaches across the millennia and touches your life today. Because if spiritual corruption could hide in bloodlines, if it could pass silently from generation to generation until the right conditions awakened it, what makes you think it stopped with the giants? What if you're not fighting new devils, but old blood that was never cleansed? What if the anger that seems to come from nowhere, the addiction that grips your family line, the depression that haunts generation after generation, the patterns of failure and defeat, what if these aren't random struggles but ancient echoes, recessive curses waiting for the right spiritual environment to spring back to life? Think about your family tree, not just the names and dates, but the patterns, the sins that seem to skip a generation before returning with renewed fury, the bondages that lie dormant until stress or compromise creates the perfect breeding ground, the giants that your grandfather fought that seemed defeated, only to rise again in your own children. This is the terrifying and wonderful truth hidden in the story of how giants survived the flood. They didn't survive as giants, they survived as seeds. Seeds of corruption that could lie dormant for centuries before finding the right soil, the right circumstances, the right spiritual weakness to germinate once more. But if giants can hide in bloodlines, so can righteousness. If curses can pass through generations, so can blessings. If the seed of the serpent could survive the flood, how much more can the seed of the woman, the promise of redemption, survive every assault of the enemy? The question that haunts us now is this: what seeds are you carrying? What recessive traits, both cursed and blessed, are waiting in your spiritual DNA? And more importantly, what environment are you creating for them to grow? Because in the end, the story of how giants survived the flood isn't just about ancient history. It's about the ongoing war between the seed of the serpent and the seed of the woman, a war that rages not just in the world, but in your very bloodline. And the outcome of that war, the outcome depends on which seed you choose to water. Could it be that the forgotten sin sleeping in your family line is the very root of your current warfare? Could it be that understanding your spiritual genetics is the key to breaking cycles that have held your lineage captive for generations? The giants may have survived the flood, but they don't have to survive you. Standing on the threshold of the promised land, the children of Israel faced a divine command that would echo through eternity, one that modern hearts struggle to comprehend, yet ancient souls trembled to obey. The God who had split seas and rained manna from heaven now spoke words that seemed to contradict everything they thought they knew about mercy. When the Lord your God brings you into the land you are entering to possess and drives out before you many nations, you must destroy them totally. Make no treaty with them, and show them no mercy. Do not intermarry with them. Deuteronomy 7:1-3. Destroy them totally. Show no mercy. Do not intermarry. These weren't the words of a tyrant drunk on conquest. These were the trembling commands of a father who had watched corruption nearly destroy his creation once before. A father who knew that what appeared to be harsh judgment was actually surgical precision, the only way to prevent a second fall. You see, what Israel was about to encounter in Canaan wasn't simply a clash of cultures or a battle for territory. They were walking into the epicenter of an ancient infection that had survived the flood itself. The giants they would face, the sons of Anak, the Rephaim, the remnants of cursed bloodlines, weren't just tall warriors. They were living proof that evil had found a way to persist, to regenerate, to rise again from the ashes of divine judgment. The danger wasn't their weapons. It wasn't their cities or their gods carved from stone. The danger was in their blood, that mysterious genetic echo of the Nephilim that pulsed through the veins of Canaan's descendants. One marriage, one compromise, one moment of thinking they could coexist with corruption, and the infection would spread like leaven through dough, like cancer through healthy tissue. God had seen this before. In the days before the flood, when the sons of God took human wives and their offspring filled the earth with violence and abomination, he had watched as humanity's genetic code became so corrupted that only 8 souls remained worth saving. He could not allow that contamination to spread again through his covenant people. And so the ancient scroll closes, but not on the story. Only on that chapter. The waters have long since receded. The ark rests silent on Ararat's peak. Noah's descendants have scattered to the 4 winds, carrying within their blood both blessing and curse, promise and peril. Yet somewhere in the shadows of our modern world, the echoes of that first rebellion still whisper. The giants did not die in the flood, they simply learned to hide. We have journeyed tonight through corridors of time most dare not enter, following breadcrumbs of divine revelation scattered across the pages of Genesis like stars in a darkened sky. We have seen how corruption found its way onto the ark, not as a stowaway clinging to its hull, but as a passenger traveling in the very bloodlines that would repopulate the earth. We have witnessed how the cursed seed of heaven's rebellion lay dormant for generations, waiting, patient as cancer, until it rose again in the sons of Anak, in Goliath of Gath, in the towering enemies of God's chosen people. But perhaps the most sobering truth we have uncovered is this: the pattern continues. The giants of our generation no longer carry bronze swords or stand 9 feet tall. They hide in ideologies that sound like wisdom but carry ancient poison. They masquerade as progress while promoting the same rebellion that once filled the earth with violence. They seduce with promises of enlightenment while leading humanity down the same path that made the flood necessary. The question that haunts every discerning heart is this: if the enemy found a way to preserve his corruption once, what makes us think he isn't doing it again? We live in days when giants walk among us not in flesh, but in spirit. Giants of compromise that tower over conviction. Giants of tolerance that dwarf truth. Giants of culture that cast shadows over the cross itself. And like the Israelites standing on the borders of Canaan, we are faced with the same divine command: do not make treaties with what God has marked for destruction. The choice before us is not new, it is as old as Eden itself. Will we have the courage to obey completely, even when God's commands pierce our comfort? Will we choose the narrow path of holiness, or will we opt for the broad road of compromise that promises peace but delivers bondage? Because make no mistake, we are not merely reading ancient history. We are living in the fulfillment of prophecy. The same spirit that whispered rebellion in Eden, that corrupted humanity before the flood, that rose again in the giants of Canaan, is stirring once more in our generation. The final battle is not come, and it is here. Yet there is hope woven into this warning, mercy threaded through judgment. For the same God who preserved Noah through the flood, who raised up David to face Goliath, who promised that the gates of hell would not prevail against his church, is still on the throne. The giants may rage, but they cannot reach heaven. They may appear invincible, but they cannot touch the eternal. And in this hour, when darkness seems to be winning, when giants seem to multiply, when compromise appears easier than conviction, remember this: you were not born by accident into this generation. You were chosen for such a time as this. Placed like Esther in the palace, positioned like David on the battlefield, appointed like Noah to preserve what is holy while the world around you drowns in its own rebellion. The giants survived the flood, yes, but they will not survive the final judgment. And until that day comes, you have a choice to make. Will you be infected by the culture around you, or will you be the infection that spreads light into darkness? Will you compromise with giants, or will you cut them down with the stones of faith and the sling of obedience? The scroll is closing on this chapter of human history, but the author is still writing. And he has given you a pen dipped in the blood of the Lamb, a voice that can speak truth into deception, a life that can stand against giants and watch them fall. The fire that once judged the world in floodwaters burns still, but now it burns in the hearts of those who refuse to bow to what God has marked for destruction. The giants have had their day, their time is ending. And in the silence that follows their fall, perhaps we will finally hear what heaven has been whispering all along. Well done, good and faithful servant. Enter into the joy of your Lord. The giants survived the flood, but they will not survive you. If you remember who you are, the story continues. The prophecy lives. The fire burns still. In worship, in witness, in victory.